There was an old convent that sat on the edge of a quiet town. It was a peaceful place, filled with gardens, tall trees, and the soft sound of prayers that floated through the halls each morning. The nuns who lived there followed a simple life, praying, teaching, helping the poor, and caring for each other. Among them was an elderly nun who had lived there for most of her life. She was gentle, humble, and always wore a calm smile. In her younger days, she had been known for her music. There was an old piano in the convent's hall, and she used to play it whenever she could. Her music had a way of making people stop whatever they were doing just to listen. The soft tunes carried through the corridors like whispers of hope. The sisters would say that when she played, it felt as if heaven itself had opened its doors for a moment. But as the years passed, things began to change. The old Mother Superior who had loved the music passed away, and a new one took her place. The new head of the convent was strict and serious, believing that music could distract from prayer and discipline. She said the convent must remain silent, devoted only to worship and service. The piano, once full of life, was covered with a cloth and pushed to the side of the hall. The elderly nun didn't argue. She only bowed her head and accepted the decision, as obedience was part of her vow, but deep inside she felt a quiet ache. For her, the piano wasn't just an instrument, it was her way of talking to God, of expressing the feelings that words couldn't say. Now that it was gone, something inside her felt still and empty. Days turned into months and months into years. The convent grew quieter, almost too quiet. There were no more songs during evening prayers, no soft notes drifting through the halls during sunrise. The young nuns who joined never knew how beautiful those moments used to be. They only knew the rule: silence. The elderly nun spent her days tending to the garden, teaching young girls who came to the chapel and helping in the kitchen. She was loved by everyone because she never complained. She moved slowly but gracefully, always humming softly under her breath when she thought no one could hear. Her humming carried a strange beauty, even without words or melody. It was the only piece of music she had left. One evening, while cleaning the hall, she stopped in front of the covered piano. Dust had gathered thickly on it. The sight made her heart sink a little. She ran her hand gently over the cloth, remembering the times she had played it. The piano had been her closest companion, one that never judged or spoke, only listened. Her eyes filled with tears, not out of sadness, but from longing. She didn't know that one of the younger nuns, who often admired her patience, had been watching quietly from the doorway. The younger sister had heard stories from the older nuns about how beautiful her playing once was. She whispered, "Why don't you play anymore?" The elderly nun smiled faintly and said, "Because sometimes silence is the song we are meant to play." Then she turned away, her steps slow and gentle. The younger sister didn't understand completely, but she could see that there was a kind of quiet strength in her. As winter came, the air around the convent grew cold. One afternoon, news spread that an important gathering would take place at the convent. Priests, villagers, and visitors from nearby towns would be attending a prayer meeting. The nuns worked tirelessly to prepare for the event, cleaning, decorating, and cooking for the guests. The elderly nun helped too, though her hands trembled more these days. She smiled through her tiredness, happy to be useful. The hall was arranged beautifully, with candles lining the walls and flowers from the garden placed on every table. The piano, though still covered, stood silently in the corner, as if waiting for someone to remember it. The evening of the gathering arrived. Guests filled the hall, their voices echoing softly as they greeted each other. There was supposed to be music. An organist from a nearby church was invited to play hymns. But as the night went on, news came that the organist's carriage had been stopped by a snowstorm and he wouldn't make it. The hall fell silent. People began to whisper, unsure of what to do next. The Mother Superior looked uneasy. She didn't want the guests to feel disappointed, but she also didn't want to go against her own rule. For a while, no one moved. Then, from the back of the hall, the elderly nun slowly rose from her seat. She walked forward, her old hands clasped together. Her voice was quiet, but everyone could hear her. "If you'll allow me," she said gently, "perhaps I can play a small hymn until the power returns." The Mother Superior frowned slightly, remembering her own rule. "Sister," she said, "you know music is not permitted here anymore." The nun bowed her head. "Yes, Mother," she replied softly. "But sometimes in moments like these, silence can feel heavier than sound." The guests turned their eyes toward them. The only light in the room came from the candles, flickering gently. Outside, the storm howled against the windows. The Mother Superior hesitated. She could see the calm in the old nun's eyes, a calm that spoke more than words ever could. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Only one hymn," she said. The old nun smiled with gratitude and moved slowly to the piano. Her fingers brushed off the layer of dust from the cover. She pulled it away, revealing the keys that hadn't been touched in years. The sight made her heart swell with emotion. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and placed her trembling fingers on the keys. At first, the sound was faint, a soft, fragile note that seemed unsure of itself. But as she continued, the music began to flow. Her fingers moved with grace and memory, as if they had never forgotten what it felt like to speak through sound. The room grew still. The guests stopped whispering. The nuns held their breath. The melody she played was simple but full of feeling. It carried the weight of years of silence, of love, of devotion. Every note seemed to tell a story, of mornings spent in prayer, of laughter long gone, of moments of quiet faith. The flickering candles seemed to dance in rhythm with the tune, casting gentle shadows across the walls. When the music rose, it felt like a prayer. When it softened, it felt like a whisper to heaven. Some of the younger nuns had tears in their eyes. The guests, too, were moved. It wasn't just the beauty of the music, it was the purity behind it. There was something so human, so honest in the way she played that everyone felt it deep within their hearts. Even the Mother Superior, who stood silently at the back of the hall, felt her chest tighten. She realized then that music wasn't a distraction. It was devotion in another form, an offering as pure as any prayer. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent for several seconds. No one wanted to break the moment. Then slowly the people began to clap softly, not out of excitement but out of respect. The old nun opened her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. She smiled shyly, bowed her head, and stepped away from the piano. Afterward, no one spoke loudly. The hall was filled with a deep, peaceful stillness. It was as if something sacred had happened, something that words couldn't explain. The Mother Superior approached her quietly. She didn't say much, only placed a hand gently on her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." That night, as the snow continued to fall outside, the elderly nun knelt by her bedside and prayed. She didn't pray for forgiveness or praise. She simply thanked God for letting her play again, even if just once more. The piano had been silent for years, but in that brief moment, it had spoken louder than any sermon ever could, and though she didn't know it yet, that one night would become a story that spread far beyond the convent walls. People would talk about the old nun who played during the storm, the one whose music brought warmth to a cold night. But for her, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was simply about finding her way back to the part of her that she thought had been lost forever. As she drifted to sleep, her hands resting gently on her rosary, she could almost hear the faint sound of piano notes echoing in her dreams, soft, warm, and eternal. After that night, the convent felt different. Something unseen had shifted in the air, like the walls themselves had been reminded of what warmth felt like. The melody that the old nun had played during the storm lingered in everyone's hearts long after the candles had gone out. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clean over the snowy courtyard. Birds sang outside, their chirping echoing softly through the open windows. The sisters went about their work quietly, but their faces carried a calm glow. Even the Mother Superior, who usually kept her expression strict, walked a little slower, her thoughts far away. The old nun spent the morning in the garden, her favorite place. The snow had covered the flowers, leaving only the tops of the bushes visible. She brushed the snow off the small statue of the Virgin Mary and smiled to herself. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She felt alive in a way she hadn't for years. She thought of how the guests had listened, how their eyes had softened when she played. She hadn't played for praise, but it moved her to know that music could still touch people. She whispered a small prayer, thanking God for letting her share that moment. When she returned inside, the younger nuns were waiting near the kitchen, whispering to each other. They stopped talking as she entered, their faces lighting up. One of them spoke softly. "Last night was beautiful." "I didn't know you could play like that." The old nun smiled. "It's been a long time," she said. "The piano was just sleeping. I only woke it up for a while." The younger nuns laughed quietly. They had grown up in silence, and for them, Hearing music inside the convent walls felt like discovering sunlight after a long winter. Later that day, the Mother Superior called her into her office. The old nun entered slowly, hands folded before her. The room was small and neat. The only decoration, a crucifix on the wall and a vase with dried flowers. The Mother Superior looked thoughtful rather than stern. "You broke a rule last night," she said calmly. "Yes, Mother," the old nun replied. "You know why that rule exists." "I do," she answered. "But last night I felt it was not for my sake that I played. The storm had frightened everyone. I only wanted to bring peace." The Mother Superior sighed. "You did," she admitted. "Even I felt something. I can't explain it. Perhaps it was peace, or perhaps something deeper." She paused, studying the old nun's kind, weathered face. "But we must still keep order. The piano will remain closed except for special occasions." The old nun nodded. "Of course, Mother. I understand." When she left the office, she felt no resentment. Her heart was light because she knew that one small act of faith had already done more than years of silence could. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread beyond the convent. The visitors who had been there that night told others about the music they heard. Some said it sounded like the voice of angels. Others said it made them feel a peace they hadn't known before. People began stopping by the chapel gates, hoping to hear her play again. The nuns grew curious about the attention. They didn't know how to respond to the townspeople who came with flowers, candles, or small notes of thanks. The Mother Superior ordered the gates to remain closed, but she could not stop the stories from spreading. One afternoon, a group of children from the village stood outside the iron fence, peering in. They were laughing and holding little paper stars they had made. When they saw the old nun sweeping the path, they waved. "Will you play again?" one of them asked, their voice full of innocence. She looked up, smiling gently. "Not today," she said. "Maybe someday when the time is right." The children nodded, though they didn't fully understand what she meant. They just knew her smile made them feel warm, even in the cold wind. Inside the convent, life continued quietly. The days were long and filled with prayer and chores. Yet something had changed in the way the sisters looked at her. They treated her not just as an elder, but as someone carrying a quiet light. Some asked her to hum while they worked, saying it helped them stay calm. And sometimes, late at night when everyone was asleep, she would walk to the hall and sit near the piano. She wouldn't play, just rest her hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface under her fingertips. It was enough to remind her that her gift still lived inside her, waiting patiently. One snowy evening, a knock came at the convent door. A young man stood there, soaked from the cold. He introduced himself as a seminarian, a student training to become a priest. He had heard the stories about the nun who played during the storm and wanted to meet her. The Mother Superior was cautious, but she allowed him to speak with the old nun in the courtyard. He told her that he was studying sacred music and that her story had deeply inspired him. He said he wanted to learn more about the connection between faith and sound, how a song could touch the spirit as deeply as a prayer. The old nun listened quietly. Then she said, "Music is prayer when it comes from love. It's not the notes or the rhythm that matter, it's the heart behind them." He nodded thoughtfully. "Would you ever consider sharing your music again?" he asked. "Just once more so that others might understand what true devotion sounds like." She smiled kindly. "I've already shared it," she said. "If the music reached people's hearts, it is no longer mine to give. It belongs to them now." The young man was moved by her words. He thanked her and promised to return someday. Before he left, he handed her a small rosary he carried. "For your hands," he said, "the ones that made heaven sing." That night, as she prayed, she thought about his words. A small part of her longed to play again, not for recognition or for anyone's praise, but simply to let her heart speak once more. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The convent received a letter from a nearby parish. They were hosting a small charity event and requested if someone from the convent could perform music to raise donations for the poor. The Mother Superior hesitated at first, unsure if she should allow it. But after much thought, she called the old nun to her office again. "There is a request from the parish," she said. "They ask for music. I don't know if I should send anyone." The old nun stayed silent, waiting. Finally, the Mother Superior looked up and said, "Would you be willing to play there? It would not be here in the convent, it would not break our silence." Her eyes brightened. "If it is for charity, then yes, Mother. I would be honored." The event was simple, held in a small church lit by candles. People from nearby villages came, bringing what little they could to donate. When the old nun sat at the piano, her hands trembled, but her heart was steady. She began to play softly, just as she had that night in the convent. The sound filled the church with warmth. Her music spoke of kindness, of faith, of gentle hope that survives even when the world grows cold. Some people closed their eyes and prayed. Others wiped silent tears. When she finished, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was full, like the air after rain. After the event, a local priest approached her. "Your music heals," he said. "It reminds people that God still speaks, just not always in words." She bowed her head humbly. "I only play what my heart feels," she replied. When she returned to the convent, the Mother Superior met her at the gate. "You did well," she said quietly. The people were grateful. "I have received letters already." The old nun smiled faintly. "It wasn't me, Mother. It was the music." That night the convent was quiet again, but it no longer felt like emptiness. The walls seemed to carry a warmth that words could not describe. The old nun sat by her window looking out at the moon. Her hands rested on her lap, still trembling slightly from the performance. She thought about how strange life was, that something she had once been told to give up had now become her greatest way to serve. The silence had taught her patience, and the long years of obedience had shaped her heart in ways she didn't understand until now. She closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself. Perhaps the music was never mine to begin with. It was always his. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the convent, peace reigned. The sisters slept soundly, the halls resting in quiet faith. And somewhere deep within the stillness, if one listened closely enough, it felt as though faint notes of music still lingered in the air. Gentle, forgiving, eternal. Word about the old nun's music traveled farther than anyone in the convent could have imagined. At first, it was only the nearby villagers who spoke about it, sharing stories of how her piano playing brought peace to people's hearts. But soon, travelers passing through the town carried the story to other places. They spoke of an elderly nun whose gentle hands could make a piano sound like prayer. The convent remained quiet, unaware of how much her music had touched the world outside. Inside those walls, life went on as usual. Prayers at dawn, meals in silence, and chores that filled the day. Yet something subtle had changed. The sisters smiled more often now. Even the Mother Superior, who had once feared that music might lead to pride, had begun to see it differently. One afternoon, as the nuns were preparing food for the poor, a knock echoed through the old wooden door. When it opened, a young man stood outside holding a small bundle of letters. He was from the nearby parish and said that people had been sending messages for the nun who plays the piano. The Mother Superior frowned slightly at the attention, but curiosity got the better of her. She gathered the sisters in the hall as the letters were opened. Inside were handwritten notes, some short, some long, all heartfelt. One said, "Your music reminded me of my mother's prayers." Another read, "When I heard you play, I felt peace for the first time in years." There were even small drawings from children, crayon sketches of a nun sitting at a piano, smiling. The old nun listened quietly, her hands folded. She didn't speak, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. It was strange for her to think that her simple act of faith had reached people she would never meet. Later that evening, she sat by the window of her small room. The sky was pale with sunset, and the air smelled faintly of rain. She could still hear the echoes of the day's letters in her mind. It wasn't pride that filled her heart, it was gratitude. Gratitude that something so small, so pure, could travel beyond walls and rules, touching lives she didn't even know existed. But not everyone saw it the same way. Some within the convent began to worry that the attention might bring unwanted visitors. The convent was meant to be a place of quiet devotion, not public praise. The Mother Superior called the old nun to her office once again. "You've become known far beyond our walls," she said gently. "People are writing, asking to hear you play again. But we must remember who we are. The convent is a house of prayer, not a concert hall." The old nun nodded humbly. "I understand, Mother. I never asked for anyone to know me. The music was only meant to serve." The Mother Superior sighed. "I believe you, but I fear the world outside will not understand such simplicity. People chase stories. They see miracles where there are only humble hearts." The old nun smiled faintly. If the music brought someone closer to peace, then perhaps that is miracle enough. The Mother Superior said nothing more. There was no anger in her voice, only worry. She was beginning to see that something larger than both of them was at work. Weeks passed quietly. Yet every few days new letters arrived. Some people left flowers near the gate. A few even traveled miles to stand outside, just to pray near the convent walls. They said the air around that place felt calm, as if the echoes of her music still lingered. The old nun continued with her duties, feeding the poor, teaching young girls to read scripture, and tending to the small garden. She rarely spoke of the letters or the visitors. Her life remained simple, her heart steady. Then one morning, as she was working in the garden, she heard faint humming behind her. Turning around, she saw a young novice, one of the newest nuns, humming a tune softly. It took her a moment to realize it was the same melody she had played during the storm. The young nun froze, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." The old nun smiled gently. "Don't apologize. Music is meant to be shared even in whispers." From that day on, soft humming became more common in the convent. When they cleaned, some sisters hummed quietly. When they cooked or washed clothes, gentle tunes rose above the sound of running water. The silence was still there, but it had become a living silence, one that breathed and carried warmth. One evening, as the sun was setting, the young seminarian returned. He carried with him a small wooden box. He had traveled to different parishes, collecting donations for the poor, and had come to deliver them to the convent. When he saw the old nun again, he smiled warmly. "People haven't stopped talking about your music," he said. "They say it makes them feel close to heaven." She shook her head with a humble laugh. "Heaven doesn't need me for that," she said softly. He placed the box on the table and then hesitated. "There's something I'd like to ask," he said carefully. "I'm studying sacred music for my final paper. I want to understand how sound and faith meet in the heart. Would you let me record your playing? Only for learning. No one else will hear it unless you allow." The old nun looked down at her hands. They were wrinkled, the skin thin like parchment. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked up, her eyes calm and bright. "If it can help someone understand that music is a form of prayer, then yes," she said. "But not for fame, only for faith." That night, after evening prayers, the Mother Superior allowed it. She didn't speak much, but the old nun could tell that even she wanted to hear those notes again. The seminarian set up a small recorder, its red light blinking softly in the candlelight. The old nun sat at the piano. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She didn't think about the people outside or the letters or the world. She only thought about God, about love, about the simple beauty of sound. Her fingers touched the keys, and the first note rose gently into the still air. The melody was soft, like a whisper. It spoke of kindness, of patience, of a lifetime of quiet devotion. The young seminarian watched, deeply moved. He felt as if he were witnessing something sacred, not performance but prayer made visible through sound. When she finished, there was silence. Even the candlelight seemed to pause. The seminarian wiped his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," she smiled. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was the heart speaking." He promised to keep the recording safe, but word of it somehow spread, as things often do. Months later, that small recording began to circulate quietly among churches and students. People shared it in secret, saying it gave them peace. The melody found its way to places far from the convent, cities, hospitals, even homes where people were sick or lonely. The old nun didn't know any of this at first. She lived her days as always, praying, teaching, and walking slowly through the garden. But she began to notice something. More people came to the chapel, sitting quietly in prayer. Some brought flowers, others just sat in silence, as if listening to something unseen. Then one day a letter arrived addressed to her. It was from a hospital in another city. The letter said, "Your music was played for the patients here. Many said it gave them peace and helped them sleep. Thank you for reminding us that beauty can heal." When she read it, tears filled her eyes. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." That evening, as she walked through the dim hallway, she passed by the piano again. This time she didn't touch it. She only bowed her head and smiled. She realized now that music didn't belong to the person who played it. Once it was born, it belonged to every heart it touched. The Mother Superior came to her later that night. "You've done something none of us expected," she said softly. You've reached people without leaving these walls. The old nun nodded gently. It wasn't I who reached them, Mother. It was the gift itself. I was only the hands. The Mother Superior looked at her for a long moment, her eyes soft with understanding. Then she said, "Perhaps the world needed to hear what we had tried to keep silent." The old nun smiled faintly. "Sometimes silence gives birth to the most beautiful sound," she replied. That night the convent was peaceful. The sisters slept soundly. Outside, the world carried her music in unseen ways, through whispered prayers, through quiet hearts, through distant speakers playing the soft hum of faith turned into sound. And as the moonlight touched the piano keys, the old nun sat by her window, hands folded, and whispered one last prayer of gratitude. For though she was just one woman in a small convent, her music had found its way into the hearts of countless souls, and that, she knew, was all she had ever been meant to do. The days grew longer, and the chill of winter began to fade from the convent walls. The garden outside came alive again, small green shoots pushing through the earth as if life itself had decided to begin anew. Inside the convent, peace had settled like a soft blanket. The old nun continued her simple routines: morning prayers, teaching scripture, tending to the garden, and helping in the kitchen. Her life was quiet, yet something about her presence made everyone feel lighter. Even those who didn't know her well could sense a kind of calm that followed her wherever she went. Though she never asked, she had learned about the recording. The young seminarian had written her a letter, telling her how people were sharing the music quietly, how it had brought comfort to the sick, and how priests in distant churches were using it in prayer gatherings. The old nun had smiled when she read it. She didn't feel pride. She felt something deeper, peace. She was glad that the music was being used to heal, not to glorify her name. But not everyone saw it that way. Some people in the church hierarchy began asking questions. Who was the nun in the recording? Why was her music circulating without permission? The Mother Superior was questioned by visiting priests, and though she tried to calm their worries, she could see that attention from the outside world was growing. One morning, after prayers, she asked the old nun to meet her in the small office overlooking the garden. The air between them was gentle, but heavy with unspoken concern. "You must know, sister," the Mother Superior began quietly. "The world has begun to notice you." The old nun smiled softly. "I have noticed nothing, Mother, except that the garden is growing again." The Mother Superior sighed. "They say your recording has reached places far from here. I have received letters from priests and even one from a cathedral in the city. They want to meet you, to invite you to play publicly, but that is not our way." "I understand," the old nun said simply. "I do not wish to travel. My music was never meant for fame." The Mother Superior looked at her for a long time. "I believe you," she said, "but the world outside is restless. When it finds beauty, it tries to claim it. Promise me you will not play for anyone outside without my blessing." "I promise," the old nun said softly. Weeks passed quietly again, though whispers still surrounded the convent. People came to pray at the gate, leaving flowers and candles. Some claimed that just standing there brought them peace. The sisters tried to live as they always had, but even they felt something sacred was unfolding around them. Then one evening, just before sunset, the young seminarian returned. He looked different, older, wiser, and yet deeply troubled. The Mother Superior was away that night visiting another convent, and the old nun greeted him at the door. He looked hesitant as he spoke. "Sister, I have come with a request. Please forgive me for asking, but there's something important I must tell you." She led him inside to the small hall, where the piano sat silently under its cloth cover. The light from the candles made the air warm and golden. He continued, "I'm finishing my study on sacred music. The recording you allowed me to make has touched so many hearts. But many don't believe it's real. They think it was edited or that someone added effects. They can't understand how simple playing can move people like that. I wish I could show them the truth." The old nun listened quietly. "You want me to play again?" she said softly. He nodded. "Just once more. I'll record it, not to share publicly, but to prove to my mentors that the heart matters more than skill. I promise it will be for learning only. No one else will know." The nun lowered her eyes for a moment. She thought of her promise to the Mother Superior. But then she thought of what the young man had said, that people no longer believed in the power of pure, honest feeling. That music had become about performance instead of meaning. She closed her eyes. "If this helps others understand that truth," she said quietly, "then we shall do it. But no one must know until the time is right." The seminarian agreed. They waited until night fell. The convent was silent, the other sisters asleep. The air carried a soft scent of jasmine from the garden. Together they uncovered the piano. Dust rose like tiny stars in the candlelight. The old nun sat down, her back straight, her fingers trembling slightly. The seminarian stood quietly beside the recorder, saying nothing. For a long moment she didn't play. She only rested her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. Then slowly she began. The melody that filled the hall was soft at first, like a whisper from another world. Each note carried warmth, sorrow, love, and gratitude, all woven together in a fragile thread of sound. Her fingers moved gently but with purpose, like someone tracing old memories in the air. The music wasn't perfect. Her age showed in the uneven rhythm, the faint hesitation before each change of chord. But those imperfections made it real, made it human. It was the kind of beauty that only time and pain could create. The seminarian stood frozen. His chest tightened as he listened. The melody rose and fell like a prayer, speaking in a language that didn't need words. It was as if every moment of her life, every act of service, every night of silence, every tear she had hidden was being poured into those keys. When she reached the end, she held the final note for a moment longer than usual. It faded slowly, lingering in the air like the breath of peace itself. Then silence returned, deep, full, sacred. The seminarian had tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. This will change how I see music forever." She smiled gently. "Then it has already served its purpose." She covered the piano again slowly, as though saying goodbye to an old friend. The seminarian packed the small recorder carefully and promised again that no one would hear it without her consent. But the world has a way of finding what is meant to be heard. Weeks later, the recording reached someone at a cathedral, a priest who had long struggled with faith. He played it during a service without knowing its origin, and people wept. They said it felt like a voice of grace had entered the room. From there, it spread quietly, hand to hand, heart to heart. Back at the convent, the old nun remained unaware of how far her music had gone. She continued her days in peace, unaware that in distant towns her melodies were bringing hope to strangers. One afternoon, she was in the garden watering flowers when a group of villagers approached the gate. They had come to leave candles again, as many did, but this time they carried something else, a small radio. They placed it near the gate and turned it on. From the small speaker came a faint, familiar tune. It was her own playing, the recording from that secret night. The nun froze, her watering can slipping from her hand. The melody drifted through the air, soft and pure, just as it had been in the hall. The young sisters nearby looked at her in surprise. "That's you," one of them whispered. The old nun said nothing. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from fear or anger. She simply listened. The music floated through the courtyard, blending with the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. It was no longer hers. It belonged to the world now. Later that evening, the Mother Superior returned. She had heard the story from the villagers and came straight to the old nun's room. "Did you know this would happen?" she asked softly. "No," the nun replied, "but perhaps it was meant to." The Mother Superior looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You have done more for the world with your silence and your song than many do with words." The old nun smiled faintly. "It was never my doing, Mother. The music only found the ears it needed. That night she prayed longer than usual. She didn't pray for forgiveness or protection. She prayed for the people who heard her music, that they might find peace, that the sound might remind them of love that never fades." Outside, the world was already carrying her melody farther than she could imagine, through radios, churches, and gatherings of people who didn't even know her name. Her secret performance had become a bridge between faith and sound, between hearts that had forgotten how to hope. And though she remained behind convent walls, her music had escaped them, soft, eternal, alive. Months had passed since the world had unknowingly fallen in love with the music of the old nun. The recording continued to travel quietly from one place to another, passed like a treasure from person to person. It was never advertised, never sold, and yet it spread faster than anyone could understand. People from faraway cities began writing letters to the convent. Some said the melody had brought them comfort in their darkest moments. Others said it gave them peace when words failed. Many wrote that it reminded them of their childhood, their lost loved ones, or a faith they had long forgotten. The convent mailbox overflowed every week, and the Mother Superior didn't know what to do. The sisters tried to reply to as many letters as possible, but most of the senders had only written one thing: who played this music? The Mother Superior had promised to protect the old nun's privacy, but she also felt torn. The music had touched the world in ways no one could have predicted. People were searching for the source of hope that had reached them. Inside the convent, the old nun continued her quiet days as if nothing had changed. She tended to the garden, washed dishes, and prayed with the others. She never asked about the letters. She didn't seek attention. Her heart was calm and her faith steady. But one night, while sitting near the window, she saw a small group of people outside the gate, holding candles and humming the melody. It was soft, almost like a prayer. They didn't know she was watching. They had come not to see her, but to thank whoever had played the music that had healed something inside them. She felt her eyes grow wet. It wasn't pride that filled her heart, it was awe. Awe at how something so small, something born in silence, could reach so far. The next morning she went to the chapel early, before anyone else was awake. She knelt before the altar and whispered, "If this music has found its way into hearts, then let it be your work, not mine." The following weeks brought even more letters. Some were from hospitals. Nurses wrote that they played the recording for patients who were afraid or in pain, and many of them calmed down instantly. In one letter, a man wrote that his grandmother had passed away peacefully while listening to it, a faint smile on her face. The Mother Superior finally went to speak with the old nun again. She found her sitting near the garden, trimming the small plants with slow, patient hands. "People will not stop asking," the Mother Superior said softly. "They want to know your name. Some want to see you to thank you." The old nun shook her head. "They don't need to know who I am. Let them believe the music came from where it truly did, from above. But they keep sending donations, gifts, and messages," the Mother Superior continued. "They say they owe their peace to you." The old nun smiled gently. "Then tell them to give their thanks to God, or to life, or to love, whichever they understand." "I'm only a small hand that touched the keys," the Mother Superior nodded slowly. Deep down she knew the nun was right. But the world didn't stop searching. A journalist eventually discovered where the recording had come from. He wasn't loud or disrespectful. In fact, he came quietly, knocking at the convent gate with a notebook in his hand. He explained that he had traveled across towns and villages, trying to find the person behind the mysterious piano piece that had brought people together. He didn't want to cause trouble. He only wanted to tell the truth about the music that had become a symbol of hope. The Mother Superior looked torn. She didn't know what to say. Finally, she told the journalist, "If you truly wish to understand, then you may sit in our chapel tomorrow during prayer, but do not ask questions. Just listen." The next morning, the chapel was filled with the usual soft murmurs of prayer. The journalist sat quietly at the back, surrounded by sisters in simple robes. He expected silence, but when the prayers ended, the old nun rose slowly and walked to the piano. She hadn't played in weeks. But something inside her told her it was time. Her fingers found the keys like they were greeting an old friend. Then, without a word, she began to play. The sound filled the room like sunlight pouring through stained glass. The notes were gentle, trembling with age, but strong in spirit. Each chord seemed to speak of forgiveness, of patience, of love that asks for nothing in return. The journalist felt his throat tighten. He had listened to that same melody many times before, through recordings, through radio broadcasts, but hearing it there, in that small chapel, surrounded by quiet faith, made it feel entirely different. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a long time. No one clapped. No one moved. It was as if the air itself was praying. Later, the journalist asked for permission to write about what he had seen. The Mother Superior hesitated, but the old nun said gently, "Let him write. Maybe someone who reads it will remember what peace sounds like." The article was simple, written with respect. It didn't name her. It only described an unnamed nun from a quiet convent.